this point, I want to maximize time for the panel discussion, and I'm going to call upon Paul Kennedy from CBC, who has been a loyal supporter of these summits right from day one, and he is going to moderate the panel, and we're going to spend the next hour, hour and a half, a little bit longer, and get what we can in a real discussion among everybody. So, Paul Kennedy.
Thanks, Peter. As he mentions, I've had the great pleasure of being here from the beginning. I came to the first summit 4 years ago and was blown away, literally blown away, by the caliber of the discussion on what I deemed to be a completely important issue. And I recall leaving the stage on that occasion and going straight up to Judy and saying, you got to do this again next year. And lo and behold, the miracle happened. They didn't do it the next year, but they did it 2 years later, and now 2 years later, and I think we've got a good thing going here. And I've made reference in the past couple of days, in fact in the past 4 years, to various friends, some of them fairly powerful friends, that I think what's happening here is actually a sort of ecological or environmental version of pugwash. And that is something very important, something that the organizers, the participants, and I think even you as participants should feel proud about. And I think it's something that could have real legs, meaning if this happens every 2 years, eventually the people who aren't in the room, but we've been talking about, or who have been the elephants in the room all along, will have to listen. And we all know, after 2 days of presentations here, how much they have to listen. If I can invite the panelists to come up onto the stage, and I'll keep rambling on about what is going to happen here. In the past couple of years, I've made a radio program out of the Muskoka Summit, the past 4 years, in each of the two of them. And in fact, I've made the radio program in those past occasions only for the material that I've collected in this panel discussion. And I was sitting in the audience on Thursday morning listening to Bob, and the light bulb, not an incandescent light bulb, but a light bulb went off in my head. And it was, this whole thing is pretty wonderful. Why am I focusing only on the relatively insignificant part at the end that I have a part of? And so I made the decision unilaterally and on the spur of the moment to record all of the speeches and question and answer periods. And I've also these people have indulged me by allowing me to take them aside after the presentations to a quiet place and spend a few moments, not very long, but basically asking them questions face to face, just me asking them questions, and no secrets here. I'll tell you the question line there with all of these people on that occasion was basically, how did you get here? What made you into an environmentalist? What made you into somebody who asks the kind of questions that you ask professionally and that you are now asking not only for yourself, but for the people in this house here in Bracebridge, but also the people of Canada and the people of the planet. And those little interviews, mini interviews, will be cut together with the material that I've been collecting over the past 2 days from the microphone, with the material I'll be collecting here. We're low tech in ideas. We don't like pictures very much, and so I don't work with a PowerPoint at all, but this will be recording this session, and I can tell you now you'll be able to hear the session on ideas on June 4th, I believe it is. That being said, without further ado, I want to just take a couple moments, and I hope I'm not wasting your time, but I want to take a couple moments to remember somebody who should be here, and that would be Farley Mowat. I was actually driving up the other day when I first heard about Farley's death, and many people have many opinions about Farley. One of the most interesting ones I thought I heard was the other day, Elizabeth May, who also should be here, and I'm sure would be here if she could. Elizabeth May was interviewed about Farley, and she was mentioning his sometimes somewhat irascible, difficult character, and she characterized that character as the moments when Farley's flipping his kilt. And it's a very endearing characteristic. I suppose it really pissed a whole bunch of people off. And all I can say is that he was doing it for the right cause, with a good, solid heart in almost every occasion. He was a critically important writer in this country. He was a crucially important environmentalist. and he made Canada famous around the world for the kinds of thoughts we've been discussing in the past 2 days. Not just in Canada, around the world. I think he probably sold more books outside of this country than he sold inside this country. And I would just like to say, as I said, that it's really too bad. It's one of my great regrets that Farley couldn't be here today to participate in the conversation that we're having. That being said, it leads me into the first question that I'm going to ask everyone in the panelists. They don't know about these questions. None of them are really tricky questions. But the first question I'll ask, and I'll throw it first to Bob Sanford, who was the first speaker yesterday. It would be wonderful if Farley could be here. Who would you like to be here?
Kurt Vonnegut, if he's still alive, would very much have enjoyed the discussion on economics. Among the living, I would say that this is a nationally significant forum. And who's missing? Tony Clement, or at least someone from the senior staff. Representatives of the provincial environment, economic development and energy ministries, local candidates in the upcoming provincial election, whoever is behind cuts to the CBC, a Hollywood producer or two wants to make a science fiction movie about real pending disasters that would focus more on science and less on fiction on the matter of climate change. Thank you.
I agree with all of those individuals. The other group that I think I would like to see here is students and young people. They're conspicuously missing. Those are the folks who are coming along, who are going to be making the decisions in the future, who are going to be sitting in these seats, and I'd like for them to hear and engage in the conversation.
Since I'm here to replace Terry, I should say that Terry should be here. Because she really would have added to this conversation in multiple ways. Stephen Harper should be here. The CEO of Enbridge and a whole bunch of other big companies that are the elephants in the room, as you've already said.
The students aren't among them, and they're the ones who are going to have to deal with this. If you were to ask for specific people, I have a similar suggestion. Al Gore, because he's eloquent and presents many of these issues very well and has very good insights, and Barack Obama, who could learn a lot.
Well, I'd rather like the two economists that I referred to in my talk to be here, John Maynard Keynes and Robert Solow. Solow, by the way, when in the quote that I made, I didn't give you the rest of the quote. He goes on to say, "And I see no reason at all why capitalism can't survive without growth." And I'd like to have him here to explain that.
What's the most important thing that you've learned at the 2014 Muskoka Summit?
Well, I've learned that you can have a terrific conference up here in Muskoka. So that's a very important lesson. In terms of the issues, I think I've always known the important role that water plays in the climate system, but a point was brought home, I thought, very well by Bob in his opening remarks, and so it's kind of changed my the emphasis I'll give to different issues when I talk to other audiences about the nature of the problems we've got.
The G8 was meeting in Huntsville, and this summit prepared that communique, and it was presented, I believe, by Tony Clement, I'm not sure, but to the assembled leaders. And the issue there was very much water. Fresh water was the topic of that summit, and Muskoka is a perfect place to convene something about water with the broader issues and challenges of environmentalism generally in the background. This seems like a place made in heaven for those kind of discussions.
Had I not read Peter Victor's book more than once, actually, I guess that would have been the main set of insights I would have driven. It was fun hearing him give it in person, but I guess for me the novel thing that I hadn't read in the literature and I find really intriguing was Kai's presentation and his vision of shared responsibility and how one might begin to implement it.
I learned a lot from all of the speakers But I think I learned even more from talking to all of you all. One of the things that I really felt very deeply from all of those conversations is how deeply people in this region have a sense of place, and how deeply you all are engaged with this region and care about it and want to do something to help protect it. And I think that's absolutely critical to our success, and it makes me feel even more optimistic than I felt when I got here.
Everybody else is stealing my answers here. Coming late. I learned important things from everybody, and everybody that I talked to in the same way. I guess if I have to pin it down, the one thing that and this is following on Dan's comment, the thing that I've been waiting to hear for quite a while and haven't had the chance to read about is the degrowth argument, and to have Peter explain that and really unpack it over the course of an hour and show how the economy can not grow and we can do well, even better. And then also to recognize how broadly among well-respected economists that view is beginning to be upheld. That's amazing. I think that's a really important point that should be spread very broadly.
This was a very important conference, and that it allowed me to assimilate a lot of ideas. I think I'll be doing that for some time after this. One of the things that I felt is that we were still very much at the beginning in solutions, not only in putting forward good ideas, but agreeing on them and then implementing them. And Elena's work really impressed me greatly. I was concerned, though, on why I asked the question I did at the end, is that I felt that ecosystem service science applications, no matter how brilliantly conceived, will fail if they can't be institutionalized beyond short-term, tenuously funded, small-scale research pilots. And I really felt that was important because of the further conversations noted that we have to expand these ideas beyond what they are now. And Dan's comment that nature should not be viewed as a machine producing services for one species, it led me to feel that we should be doing a lot more work on evaluation and what we mean by it and where it ought to go, and a lot more work on growth and greed.
No, the summit is drafting a communique about the issues that we've been discussing here over the past 2 days, and this is a crucial part of the summit and has been from the very beginning. A lot of work is put into this communique. In fact, I can tell you that I think I didn't look exactly at the time, but I got, an e-message from Judy sometime after midnight last night with the penultimate draft, or probably not the penultimate, but the last draft last night, which was put together how many hours after this session closed yesterday. It's a vitally important document. And my next question, and I throw it generally, so the first person who wants to answer can answer first, and please again, feel free to interrupt one another. The question is, who do you want to read this?
Based on what I've seen as the outcomes of previous Muskoka summits, that this should be read by every Canadian. And also it should be read by people who are sympathetic to these concerns in the United States and elsewhere as well. But I think it's critically important to have this communique put into position for the election in Ontario, and absolutely essential to become part of the sensibilities that we attend to with the upcoming federal election next year.
And so, who I want to read the draft as it is now, I think we still need to read it so that we can figure out who we want to read it, so that we can figure out what it should say, and it goes around like that. But, in terms of who we have something to say to, it's those same people that I think that ought to be in the room, right? It's the Stephen Harpers and the other politicians. It's also the policymakers who are actually implementing the policy in government agencies, and it's also the CEOs and business people. All across the board, there are important messages in what we've discussed for all of those folks.
This has evolved over the course of the 3 summits as well. I guess it's those sticky papers. They are really important, and you people have a big role in the drafting of the communique. So it's not as though this is something that is rained down from above. This is something that began here and began with a framework and an outline, but your input is crucial, and the people who organize this summit are absolutely adamant about making sure that's the case, and I find that to be a truly inspiring thing, and one of the reasons that I'm always happy to come back here.
I think students should read it, and their teachers. And I was struck by a Post-it note about this. Someone wrote very cursorily and said politicians and CEOs have very short attention spans. You can really only have 3 sentences. And I think that that's largely correct and a problem. So I think the communique will have to be drafted more than one way. It's going to be widely disseminated. But students actually will read things, especially if the teachers make them and quiz them on it. And as I said, students are the ones that are ultimately going to have to solve this problem. It will be solved. And the communique is or will be detailed enough that I think it should be very provocative, and I think their teachers could guide them in this to make a really useful document. I can't imagine Harper reading this and having, you know, a blinding catharsis or something.
You know, until it's finished, I can't answer the question. I mean, until the document is fully formed, it's very hard to say who I think should read it. But in that regard, I prefer to see this go the other way around. In other words, I prefer to see a clear idea on who the communique is intended for, and then to write it for that audience. I think a sort of a general purpose communique, well, I'm a bit skeptical that it will have much effect, frankly, because people like to read things written to them in their language, addressing their issues, and you can't do that for everybody in one document. So I think it's really important to be clearer on who the communique is for, and then write it in that way.
Question actually has put me in the frame of mind of thinking about another kind of question, which is who should be involved in writing it? And I'll come right back to the sort of student question that I think it's a valuable thing for students to read this document and these sorts of documents, but maybe even more valuable for them to get involved in the writing of it and to think deeply about the kind of debates that we've been having and all of the ideas that have been presented, and to think about what that means for them and where they stand on some of these issues.
Like, this is an environmental summit, and all the people in the room are, I don't think, if there is a climate denier in the room, could they please raise their hand? But I shouldn't do that, it would make it be a dangerous situation. Most of us, all of us, are committed to the kinds of causes that we've been talking about. At the same time, we've had a fairly significant environmental footprint. If I just look at the people who are sitting on the table here, think of myself. I drove a car up from Toronto. The last couple of days I've been driving back and forth between Gravenhurst and Bracebridge. I don't own a car. I almost never take public transit in the city of Toronto. I walk to work. I walk within my neighborhood. I can get anything that I need. So I'm not trying to sort of pour my guilt onto the table, except I'm wondering if there are ways that we might think about imagining a summit like this that might involve other means of pulling us all together. And automatically what comes to mind is, in some sense, cyberspace. Kai yesterday was talking about buying back points, or getting a sort of ecological payback for his Air Canada ticket, and certainly I've done that in the past, and I imagine many people in the room have. I thought it was interesting as well, though, that yesterday, and yeah, I did drive back and forth from Gravenhurst to Bracebridge, but there were always 3 people in the car with me, so we were doing the best we could that way. Driving home last night, Kai's phone rang, and his daughters were talking to him from British Columbia, and all the 3 of us, the other 3 in the car, I think were also maybe not older, but I was dragged kicking and screaming into the electronic age and wanted to resist all these sorts of things. Suddenly I saw Kai talking to his kids on the other side of the planet, and I'm thinking, maybe we should start to imagine new ways of bringing people together to do subversive things, to talk about the kinds of issues that we need to be talking about, but not having to actually bring ourselves physically together at great cost to the planet. And so I throw it out again openly to the entire panel, and ultimately to the audience, I suppose, too. What can we do to reduce the environmental footprint of people who are trying to reduce environmental footprints?
Radio.
June 4th.
They weren't just on the phone. I mean, you could see them on the phone, and it wasn't just new to Paul. I had no idea what was happening when this thing rang, because it had never happened to me before, and I just swiped it. I didn't even know how to swipe it, and all of a sudden there they were, popped up. But I mean, it's worth saying that, you know, as amazing as that was, and as a surprise, you know, for all of us, it actually didn't work well enough for me to actually hear or understand what they were saying properly. And so, you know,
We were just amazed that they reached out to touch. I mean,
yeah, that's right. So at this stage, I'm still in favor of making it all the way out here, you know, and seeing you guys in person. I know that there's a cost to the atmosphere, and that's why I am solidly committed to offsetters. And we talked yesterday about why it's not perfect, and you know, and I explained why I don't. It's actually okay for me that it's not perfect, but and you know, if you want to buy extra offsets to acknowledge that fact that it's not perfect, you know, by all means. But point is, we really get a lot of face-to-face interaction, and it can't be fully substituted. And I've got so much from being surrounded by you folks, the same way that Elena did. I couldn't have the same experience from Skype or Google Hangout, especially, and as great as they are for one-on-one chats.
On your question about how many deniers were here, and I mentioned to some of you my concern about new forms of denial. What we've seen in this whole long 40-year process is that the argument that this wasn't happening, that there was doubt among scientists. Okay, when that didn't work, maybe there's something happening, but we're not the cause. Okay, maybe we might be the cause, but we're not a big cause, and certainly we can adapt. And then more lately, too late to do anything about it, too costly to act. And I think now what we're seeing, and I think this conference underscores this, is the next one is telling us to stop scaring us or we'll shut down. So I think it's really important that denial is not dead and the pushback is just starting. And I would submit to you from my observations traveling in this country and North America and widely that this could tear us apart as a society if we do not manage it properly and we do not frame it correctly. So I was struck in terms of answering your question by a remark that Judy made at the table at dinner when we first arrived, by the number of people who lived here, the number of cottagers, and the fact that there were 1 million people who came here to experience the quality of life and the remarkable sense of place that locals possessed. So this should be the place where they come to find out these things, where they meet people who have made not just ritual but actual sacrifices to have a deep and profound connection to this place, and in whom they can trust for this type of information. So that speaks to having Muskoka being known for this conference, for this summit, and for having people come here. And I'm really with Kai in this. Some of the conversations that occurred in the very generous breaks, for which I was grateful, were some of the richest I've had. So there's value in coming here. If there's one other thing we might do is webinars with the outcomes, because there are the conversations here, and you could include those comments made by those attending the conferences and others. I mean, I think a powerful webinar series might emerge from this, in addition to, it's radio you work in, isn't it?
Television without pictures.
The best use you can make of electronic media for a conference like this is dissemination, and somehow offering opportunities for people who can't make it to the conference to benefit from it. But I would never think of substituting an in-person event like this with what can be done over the media. I occasionally get asked, or more than occasionally I'm afraid, get asked to give presentations to places that are a long way away, and I'll do something over Skype or some better technology, and you get the Q&A, but it's very formal. You don't get any of the informal discussions, which are so important. And the last one I've had is in Australia. They said, well, yes, would you do it? And I said, sure, I'll do it. And then they told me I'm on at 10 to 2 in the morning. I spoke too soon, didn't I? Anyway, so no, I don't agree with trying to substitute electronic conference for what we've experienced here. I think, I mean, I understand why you're asking the question, and then it raises in my mind this dilemma between personal responsibility for trying to solve the problems that we've been discussing and collective action. And you can go too far in one direction or the other, and I think we can go too far in the direction of thinking, well, we won't have a conference, because if we had a conference, we'd be using some fuel. I think that doesn't allow us to appreciate the overall benefit that can come out of a conference like this that wouldn't be achieved in any other way. So I'm not going to criticize what the organisers had us do. And by the way, I am walking home to Toronto. So.
I think very carefully, like Peter, I get a lot of invitations to do these sorts of things, and I think very carefully about each one and the costs and benefits, the trade-offs that are involved in terms of the environmental impact and the likely outcomes or benefits that are gonna come from it. And I think there's a reason that you all are here, and there's a reason that we all are here, and that's because we made the decision that the benefits far outweigh the costs in this case of the interactive nature. For things like webinars, they're great for disseminating information, saying what it is that we've learned, but you don't get that back and forth that I think is critical to this kind of setting.
I agree completely. This is very different from an academic lecture or an academic conference setting. And those do work pretty well with various web-based methods. And I don't even find it too onerous. Several times from Europe, I've given talks at 1 in the morning to North America, and it's well worth it. But it does not allow for the personal interactions, and particularly with such a varied, diverse audience and attendance. I think there'd be something terrible that would be lost. I guess the other thing I suggest is we need more research on telekinesis to help solve this problem.
And I want to say two things. One, I know that on the Ideas webpage, we'll be linking with the webpage for the conference, and with any of the participants who would like to be involved in that as well. And I think those kinds of webs, well, I know from many years ago, having a conversation with Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the web, that's what he wanted to happen, that was the kind of interaction that he was really hoping to create, that everybody would eventually be bound together in something that did look something like a spider's web. And I think that is where we should go. Obviously, we can't do it on a handheld phone yet. And I would say yet in another context, and that is that the technologies are moving so quickly. And although I was once a Luddite and dragged kicking and screaming into this world, the technology is moving so quickly, and I forget what the rule is called, but there was an old rule that if you wait 2 months, you'll get a machine that's 5 times stronger and half the price or something like that. Well, a few years back, I was supposed to do a seminar, actually not a seminar, an interview in Waterloo, Ontario with Malcolm Gladwell. And it turned out Malcolm couldn't come because he was being held in New York for, I forget, whatever reasons. And the seminar was being hosted at BlackBerry, or at least an institution that was funded by BlackBerry. And they actually looked into the possibility of setting up what was going to be called a holographic interview. And that was, Malcolm would be in a studio in New York with, I'm not sure how many cameras would have had to be involved. But through the magic of telecommunication, thank you, Dr. Spock, beam me up, he was going to be sitting literally across from me in a holographic form. And the interview would have taken place that way. Now, remember the rule I just quoted, 5 times more powerful at half the cost. The cost that was, at that point, made even the BlackBerry folks, and this was before anyone started having trouble with BlackBerry, was going to be $80,000, which was deemed to be slightly more than the airfare it would have cost to bring him up from New York. And so it didn't happen. But those rules do apply, and given the way the world is evolving, not just in bad ways, but sometimes in magical ways. I don't know whether I'll live to see it, but it could be possible that we can all be beamed up at some point and beamed down into the same place, or to be with people we'd like to be with, and to have these kind of conversations. Beyond that, though, a warm body and brightness of eyes when you're talking to somebody is something that will never, I think, ever be outmoded, and I hope that never happens. One of the things I've noticed from the last couple of days is that, yes, there's been great interaction after the sessions. The question periods have always been, I thought, a little too short, only because we did have to move along, and I think Peter did a great job of moving things along, keeping us on time. I've decided that there will be only one more question from me to the panelists, and I will read the rule book for that question, which is going to be read the rule book for the rest of you as well, because I wanted to open to give you all another long chance, and a good long chance now, to formulate your ideas, bring them together, and pose them to the panelists, as some sort of culmination of this rather wonderful 2 days. Before I do that, though, I'm going to ask the panelists to do something that is going to help me set the rule book, and that is I'm going to ask them all for their elevator speech about Muskoka 2014. And that's the speech where you can take it for different lengths of time. I know at the Banff Television Festival, it's the 7-second pitch. You're literally given a chance to stand in front of a whole bunch of people who have a whole bunch of money and really deep pockets and try to pitch a television show at them. But you've got to do it in 7 seconds. Not easy to do. I'm going to let the panelists try to do it in 1 minute, and I'm going to time them. And this is their summary for what's happened in the last 2 days. And then I'm going to throw it out to you, but I'm going to change the rule, and that is I'm going to watch my watch and make sure the questions are only 1 minute long, because there are a lot of people in the room, and I suspect there are a lot of questions that didn't get asked in the last couple of days. And when you ask the question today, it won't be asked just to one person who just gave the presentation. It's open to the entire panel. And believe me, from my separate private interactions with all of them over the past couple of days, there's a wonderful dynamic when they get together and start talking. Although there's a general agreement about certain basic things across the board, there are disagreements, and I think significant disagreements, and interesting disagreements, and disagreements that I think we have to deal with. So I really do want to leave it open to everyone to answer any one of your questions. But first, I'm going to ask for the 1 minute summation, and I guess we'll start again as the order that the proceedings went. Bob.
I'm going to use up 15 seconds thinking about it.
We'll give you 5 more seconds.
Okay, from my point of view, for me, it's that we're changing the composition of the atmosphere, which is causing our hydrology to change. And as a consequence of that, we're going to see cascading effects through all of our ecosystems and through every aspect of our economy. And it's important we realize that the ground is shifting in all of these domains, and we need to think carefully about what's happening so that we can adapt in a way that will allow future generations to still have the opportunities that we had in a landscape similar to what we have now.
For a long time, people on this planet had the luxury of operating as if there weren't really limits, as if we could continue to expand our activities for our own sakes without negative repercussions of those for ourselves and for others. And I think it's increasingly clear from the talks that we heard today that the time has come that we have to recognize that every action that we have has impacts on other people, and that very often those impacts come back and affect us. And more often than not, those impacts come from a whole bunch of different stressors that come from a whole bunch of different activities that are diffuse and hard to pin down. They're interacting together in complex ways. But at the end of it, we bear this shared responsibility to make the world a better place, both today and tomorrow.
These guys are intimidatingly coherent. Without repeating what other people have said, I think we face really serious environmental issues that we need to recognize come from multiple causes and multiple sources. And we're right now, I think, face to face with very critical limits in our interactions with the environment. And we've heard about a lot of good solutions that range from ethics to economics to ecosystem services to engaging citizens. In my mind, these can, and in fact, they must work together. We need to learn more about how to use the right one at the right time or in the right combination in order to address the problems that we're facing.
Does it have to be coherent?
Just throw the words out and mix them up later.
Well, we've acted as if there are no limits, and the environment is inexhaustible. We've learned that that's not true. And we've also learned that rubbing up against limits leads to interaction of many sorts of different problems, and we have to consider all of them at the same time. We've also learned that valuing in economic terms doesn't really solve our problems, our environmental problems. It's quite deficient. We need other methods of valuation. And finally, we need an ethical stance that accords value and intrinsic value to other living organisms.
agonized over how I was going to put my ideas into 45 minutes, let alone 1 minute. For the past half century or so, economic growth has been the #1 economic policy objective of governments around the world. One could understand that historically because the economy was relatively small in relation to the environment. That's all changed now. We have all of the data that we could possibly want to show that the economy of our country and other countries like us are very large in relation to the environment in terms of the resources we use, the energy we use, the waste we produce, and the land that we transform. So if we continue down this path, we are heading for disaster. Fortunately, there are some very good, promising alternatives out there in which we can reduce the impact that we have on the environment and improve human well-being and that of other species too. So in the end, I'm quite optimistic about what the future holds.
The organizers of the 2014 Muskoka Summit did a great job in choosing people.
Do you think Maslow sold us short? We've always been taught that the highest form of human achievement is self-actualization, but you are pointing out to us that there's a higher thing to achieve, living in harmony with our environment and our planet. And if we were constrained that way, wouldn't we all be better people?
I'll take the first stab at that. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is actually defined in relation to the individual. And so I think it would be consistent with Maslow's hierarchy to say that you could achieve self-actualization through serving the planet. So I mean, I don't know that he actually ever mentioned that, right? But I think it's consistent with it. Where I do think that Maslow sold us short was in suggesting that you actually need to achieve those needs at the base of his pyramid before you can have the strong need to achieve those ones higher up, right? So that we must appeal to those basic needs first. And what that's yielded is, from an environmental community, it's yielded a set of arguments that are very self-interested oriented. And so Dan talked about that today most strongly, arguing that, you know, insofar as we have retreated to this language of ecosystem services basically because, and the values of that, basically because the moral arguments aren't working, that insofar as we are only selling conservation through what it can do for people's basic material needs, we're actually missing the point that many people are very strongly motivated by those learning, self-actualization needs. And you know, I just read about this in a great book by Chip and Dan Heath called Made to Stick, and they point out that when you do that, you're dwelling in Maslow's basement, and that most people actually don't do that. And that most people are actually much more responsive to appeals to their higher needs.
To connect with other people around us and the environment around us is one of the strongest things that I see in people around me. I certainly see it in my kids when they're interacting with the environment or with people around them. They're driven by that sense of being part of something larger than themselves, whether that's a group of people that they can connect with or an environment and a place that they can connect with. And I think that's why we come together in this room instead of being on the web, is because we're really driven by that. I believe even more than we're driven by some of the basic needs.
My view of it is Maslow's hierarchy deals with us at a subsistence level. And the object should be not to let us diminish our environment to such an extent when we're reduced to that level, and that we have options and that we can aspire to higher ideals.
I think there's latent within most people an appreciation or a different sort of need that's not part of Maslow's hierarchy. And I think it's manifested best by the fact that most people think there's something wrong with a species going extinct, whatever it's doing for humans. I think most people recognize that as a problem. But transforming or mobilizing that sort of latent ethical view into a movement or a societally important, an important part of society is something we haven't really quite mastered. But it's a different kind of need. It's sort of outside the kind of hierarchy Maslow described.
Next question.
These issues we're dealing with are large and multidisciplinary, and they sort of strike at the very heart of how we live. For citizens who aren't here, who aren't as engaged, what 3 concrete actions can you suggest they do to move these things forwards?
Okay, Bob.
Well, it's quite interesting because I'm often asked in Canada, because we have so much water, what should we do about these concerns about water? And it's really interesting because we sometimes think that we could not live with less. And I'm reminded of what Europe's like. We, on average in Canada, use about 320 liters of water per person per day. And in Europe, the average is about 140 liters per day, and places like Munich, it's about 100, and of course there's other places in Australia and the Middle East where it's even less. But what I find really interesting about the European example is that you can use half the amount of water without any impact whatsoever on your quality of life. So for me, the idea would be to know where your water comes from, know what you use it for, and what others use it for, and know that it's going to be a lot more precious in the future.
One of the things that I'm very focused on is information literacy and science literacy. I think information these days is very cheap. We can go on the internet and find just about anything that we want to know, but understanding what constitutes good information, where that information comes from, how science produces it, and the value of funding that science so that we can continue to have good information, to grow good information, to learn more about systems is incredibly important. And I would encourage everyone to engage with science and do the work to develop their science literacy and their information literacy.
The first thing is political. We can vote with the environment really at the top of our concerns, rather than just another concern among many when we choose among candidates. I think that's probably the single most important thing we can do in a Western democracy. The second has already been stated. We can try hard to understand the real environmental costs of market products that we deal with. I was thinking of those environmentally sound seafoods that Kai showed. I said we've all seen those, and I've gone to the trouble of actually studying them to figure out which ones are worth something and which aren't. It takes some time, but it's well worth doing. So we vote with our pocketbooks. We really will bring about changes. And the third, I guess, something that most of us can't really do, but we need more environmental prophets, like McKibben would be one, and we have to pay attention to them. And they can really move humanity in ways that we as academics can't. But some of us can do that, and some of us can't.
And they're all around this idea of making it normal to take responsibility for our environmental impacts and their social consequences. And I think you can do that in 3 ways today. The first is to offset your flights, your vehicle, your car driving, and to do so conspicuously. You know, do it like I do. Make it clear that you're doing it. Put a badge on your car. Put a luggage tag on your baggage so that people know you're doing it, right? This is about norm change. And so the more that you can be conspicuous in that, not in an obnoxious way, but in a proud way, the stronger that message will be, and the more likely it will be to ripple out. The second is commit to something like C3.3 or some other kind of scheme where if it were possible to actually exhaustively, you know, not just for greenhouse gas emissions, but for all kinds of impacts on ecosystems and the ecosystem services, that you would do so. And the third is to help design solutions like that. We've been so focused on fighting the fires in individual places, you know, preventing the bad things from happening where we live and where we know. We need to pay a lot more attention to the kinds of solutions that can spiral out globally, the kinds of solutions that can go viral. So that's what I would charge you for number 3.
The question was, what would we suggest as individuals to do? Well, I think the first thing I would say is join a citizens group and or a political party. It's more than just voting. It's becoming quite active in your community. I happen to favour the David Suzuki Foundation being a board member, so I will mention that, but there are many other good groups. So that would be the first thing, get involved with a group, because this can't all be done by pleading with individuals to change individual behavior. It needs group action. Secondly, it's a question of time. For me, the scarcest thing in my life is time. And I suspect other people find the same problem. So as a rule of thumb, I would say reduce screen time, whatever the screens are that you are spending time with, try and find ways to reduce that, so that will, my third one, allow you to spend more time with family and friends and in nature.
It's wonderful sitting in a room with a group of like-minded people and listening to a group of people who expand our knowledge base and the ideas. There's a group of people that I don't even begin to come close to understanding, and that's the people who are accumulating obscene amounts of wealth right now globally and are having a phenomenal impact on all of us in this room and our environment, and would be curious to hear any comments about that aspect of this particular debate.
Unfortunately, I don't know any such people very well. If I did, I'd have all kinds of things to say to them. My belief, though, just based in human nature and what I've read about a bunch of these people, biographies and the like, is that, and thinking of, folks like Bill Gates, who did accumulate a huge amount of money and then now is really focused, and Warren Buffett for another, really focused on trying to do good with that. And so, I would say that even though people get into this mindset, for a portion of their life, they still have values like you and I, and we can still reach them on common ground, in terms of the kinds of things that they could also do at the same time. Like I said, I'm no expert in having those conversations because I don't have any such people in my back pocket who are funding my activities, but so take it with a grain of salt, but that's what I try.
The question you've really raised is all about distribution. It's who gets what out of the economy. And as I mentioned when I spoke this morning, that used to be a much more central issue of concern to economists than it's been for quite a long time. But actually that's changing very rapidly because of the release of this new book that you may well have heard of by Thomas Piketty called Capital in the 21st Century. And it's very unusual for a 700-page book by an economist to somehow capture the imagination, that it's being reviewed everywhere, he's being interviewed everywhere, and I've started reading it, and I can see why it's a very high-quality book. Basically, he says, look, there are two players in the economic system. There are the owners of capital, and there are the owners of labor. And that he then looks at the distribution of national income between those two groups and shows that there's been, back in the 1920s, the owners of capital received a very high proportion of total national income. That went into decline in relative terms for reasons he goes into, and for the last decade or so it's been on the rapid increase again. We're back to the levels of the 1920s, if not beyond that. So we're facing, I think, we face many crises. Now we have a crisis of distribution that's being recognized as such. So you can have, as we've had, economic growth, and yet a very large majority of the people in the economy see no benefit from it. I would like to turn that to our advantage, to say, well, not only have you not seen any benefit from it in economic terms, look what it's been doing to the environment. Again, triggering a discussion about a new way to go. Now, you're asking about those who have benefited heavily from this historical turn towards a very unequal distribution of income and wealth. Some of them have a philanthropic bent, and of course do support important work. I want to mention in that regard George Soros, who funds the Institute for New Economic Thinking, which is trying to get economists to rethink the way the economy functions and so on. But many don't have that. They are the best to talk to each other. So, it's a question of credibility. We each have credibility in certain circles. Within that circle, a guy like George Soros has the credibility, and he and others have to be supported in the efforts they're doing to change the mindset of their equally rich friends and acquaintances.
So wealth and where it resides now has so much influence on the capacity that we have in science and translating science into language that people can understand. And from my perspective, it's been very difficult not to be drawn into and toward wealth in that way. And I feel like I fought my whole life for the independence that I have now from that. And I'm of the view now, in thinking about that question, is that there's things I can do and others that I can't. So from my point of view on that is I've had to focus on what I can do and do it as well as I can, and hope that that has a radiative effect. And that by working hard and being as consistent as possible with those values, that might influence some of those who have that wealth to act in different ways and to support things like what we're talking about here at Muskoka.
In this conference, we've seen a lot of trajectories on statistics for the economy and other measures over time. And I think most of the people here in the room are here because we're concerned about the future. And the panelists certainly have spent a lot of time thinking about the future as well. And I was wondering if you could think about, let's say, 50 years from now, and what is it that you're imagining that this world is going to look like? Is it going to be positive? Is it going to be negative? What's the imagery that you see in your mind when you think about that? And if you want to, let's say, select a movie or a book that best represents that, feel free to do so.
The future 50 years from now will be decided by the decisions we make today and ever after until the 50 years arrives. So I'm more interested in trying to understand the range of possibilities 50 years in the future, not trying to think which one is somehow more likely. I just don't get anywhere with that line of thought. And I'm also struck by the incredible uncertainty that there is when you look at the projections of people who do try to forecast the future. I'll just give you one example. If you look at UN forecast of global population, mid-century, they have a low, medium, and high forecast. The difference between the low and the high forecast for 2050 is the same as the total population of the planet in 1950. It's a $3 billion error range, and they're not even confident that they're going to stay within the error range. So it's a bit of a mugs game, I think, to sort of say, I think that's where we're going. It's much more important, to my mind, to say, what are the key decisions before us that would really make a difference, and let's make those and then keep striving along the path that those decisions create, rather than losing a lot of sleep, which you can do if you become really pessimistic about what the future may hold.
Before I came to McGill, I was involved in helping to develop the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment scenarios, which are stories about possible futures of the Earth in 2050. So I would encourage you all to go look at those. And I think I'll just talk a little bit about something I learned from doing that, which is that I don't think there's any easy, obvious win-win solution. We're facing a lot of hard decisions. So for example, we developed a scenario in which we attempted to, and I forget who had this in their talk, but we attempted to get rich first and then get smart. And we discovered in developing that story that that doesn't actually work very well, because there's a lot of things that we just can't get smart about fast enough. We also had a scenario in which things became more local, more watershed focused, more environmental, which heading into it I thought sounded great. As we developed the story, it turned out there were a lot of larger scale or global environmental issues that don't get addressed when everyone is focused inward on their local environment. So I think one of the critical messages for me to come out of being involved in that is that we have a lot of hard decisions to make, and that we need to think very carefully about the pros and cons of each of those decisions, not just now, but 20, 30, 50 years out into the future, and decide together as a group what kind of world we want to live in, and then to take the action we need to make that come about.
I'm no prophet, and so I'm not going to give you a most likely scenario either, but I mean, I can tell you my vision for the future, and I think about this a lot, as you said. I mean, just because it really does help to have some hope. And so I envision a world where, just like with the toilets and the chamber pots, right, where in 50 years, it's just absolutely normal that we're conscious of our responsibilities for the rest of the planet, and that we're conscious of the impacts that go along with the activities that we pursue, the purchases that we make, our lifestyles, and that it's actually normal. We're conscious of it, but we don't think about it much, and that it's absolutely normal for us to do things like offset for not just greenhouse gases, but for everything else, and that we're also well involved on the local scale, in our own places, in doing the things that steward those systems, and that we're more aware of how those systems work, so that we can understand what the watersheds in these areas and the lakes in these areas might look like if they're better and wilder, and what it might take to get there, I mean, so that's my vision for the future, and it's completely idealistic, and so it may be a 0.00001 probability, but you know, if I spend my whole life working towards it, then that'll be good enough for me.
I think for me, 50 years is a long way out too, and I agree with some of the other speakers. I'm sure everyone in the audience knows that a great deal could happen in that. It's up in the air because we're making choices about that now. What I find in the work that we do is that the really critical period is now in the next 10 to 15 years. And the reason why I say that is that it's during that time that you're going to see the real effects of temperature changes and precipitation patterns. And it's like going into the bathroom and turning the tap on, and you turn the hot water tap on, and it comes out cold for a while until the system catches up with itself. And we are looking at between 2025 and 2030 is a very difficult period where these transitions will start to cascade together. And so I worry that people who say, well, I'm not going to be here for that, or what's happening now is really of no consequence because it's beyond my time frame, are probably wrong on that. And I suppose the thing that I'm concerned about 2050 and even before that is water and what water does. Because what we're seeing on a global basis is that a new realization of how much water nature needs to pump the hydrological cycle, and also to sustain the conditions that we have on the planet. What we're seeing is that realization has already been exceeded in terms of our use. So if we give water to nature, that's going to be taken out of agriculture, which means people will have less. And if you give water to agriculture, then it's going to mean that biodiversity-based life support planetary functions are going to be diminished. And that's what troubles me about the future. So I think it's 2025 to 2030 is what we ought to be looking at and aiming to make the trade-offs and the adjustments that the other panelists are making. But I see a much greater urgency than we presently possess over the matter.
I think we can say with great certainty some things about 50 years from now, and it's really not that far away. We're certain that the Earth will be quite a bit warmer. We're not certain that there will be more extreme weather events, but we are certain that extreme weather events will be more extreme. And we know the Earth will be more crowded, even if the most optimistic predictions of a demographic transition occur. So we know all those things are true. But beyond that, I would agree with Peter that there are many possibilities, a whole range of things we can do that even within those three constraints will make the future very different depending on what we do. And some of it will make for a better planet, and others will make it even worse, and we have to focus on those.
I'm always troubled with negotiating. Whatever happens in the next 10 years, we're in a negotiating game. And so when we negotiate, the scholarship suggests it makes a lot more sense to not talk about positions until you've agreed on principles. And that's in part because people's beliefs really matter, and if people's beliefs are wrong, but they're going to act on them anyway, you're in trouble, and it's very difficult to change people's beliefs. I was also really struck by Bob's comment earlier that things could really fall apart in Canada, is the impression I suspect a battle between the Albertans and everyone else or something, I'm not sure. So the question I have is, I have a sense that we're spending too much time on arguing positions and not enough time getting all the people that have to work together to agree on the principles of what it is we're trying to do, either economically or ecologically, and I wonder if the panel might comment on that.
I agree with you completely, and I just want to use another water example. You have to have a vision of what you want, and then the example I'm going to give is highly damaged rivers in Europe, and it started with the Danube, and many of you know some of the extraordinary spills that occurred in those places. But what emerged out of that was a vision that they didn't want their rivers to be contaminated. They wanted to have fish in it, they wanted to be able to swim in it, they wanted to be able to drink the water. So what do? So what was done was the creation of the European Union Water Framework Directive. And what's interesting about it, which speaks to your question, is that the vision was set, and each EU country could achieve that vision by whatever mechanism they thought was most appropriate locally. And it gave people license to do what was within their means and within their unique cultural and economic circumstances to do that. It's been slow, but it's been proven to be one of the best examples in the world for doing that. We don't have that in North America. We don't have that in Canada. In the European Union Water Framework Directive, they have 18 different languages. They have 160 million people. And I'm told that we can't do that in Canada. We have 32 million or 33 million people in 2 languages, officially at least. But these things are possible. These models are out there. And they offer hope and they offer example. And I agree with you that it's to avoid hopelessness, you've got to be able to see how you can act. And I think having a vision of what you want is absolutely critical, and we need to have that in this country rather than having our federal government back off the stage of that vision and allow us to atomize so that we do feel helpless and then we are constantly negotiating with ourselves what we ought to do. There has to be a framework to which we can appeal and aspire to if we wish to succeed in this project.
I agree also. What I'd add is that in this country, what we lack right now is the mechanisms, the institutions, and the context to have those conversations usefully. Right? Because if it's not over a particular region and what to do over the next few years, or if it's not over a particular project, then it becomes motherhood and apple pie, and people say things at such a general level that nobody else can disagree, and you don't really get anywhere. But, so I'm going to pause and think for a moment about Canadian current events environmentally. And, what we have at the moment with major infrastructure decisions is decisions by a series of ultimatums, right? That's what the environmental assessment process is about, right? It's the Canadian federal government, along with companies, saying, we'll build this pipeline, or we won't, and we won't bring you our jobs, and we won't do this. There's no choice there. Every choice is a false choice or a very, very limited choice. And what we really ought to have, and everybody in the environmental assessment field agrees that what we need to have is cumulative effects assessment. We need to understand the cumulative effects of a whole bunch of infrastructure decisions, along with what is already happening on the land base. Now, there is a provision in the Environmental Assessment Act federally and also in most of the provincial ones that we ought to assess cumulative effects. But what that means in practice is a very brief consideration in the scope of each project's assessment, any additional considerations that would go along with adding this project to the current land base. Now, what that means is basically that whereas what we want to know is basically how many pieces of straw should we put on the camel's back before the camel's back will break, right? How many pieces of infrastructure should we add to the landscape before our water quality is lost? But we're trying to decide that by, for every piece of straw, estimating whether that's going to be the one. It's a ridiculous waste of time, and it's super difficult, right? It doesn't make sense. And so we're solving death by 1,000 cuts in this cut-by-cut way. It doesn't make sense. So cumulative and strategic environmental assessments are the way to go forward, but governments need to champion that and not be afraid of the answers that may be lurking and waiting for them.
So in terms of having a vision and a way forward, I'll just use this as a chance to plug and tell you all about my latest project that I'm involved with called the Good Anthropocene, which is all about collecting examples of elements of where we're doing it well around the world. So we're working with a team of people that is literally based all around the world in every kind of community through real conversation and through social media to try to collect examples of what we are doing well and how can we pull those elements together to think about what kind of world we want to live in. And I would propose that I think we could do that very profitably for a Canadian-specific vision as well.
I'm not a Canadian, so I have not nearly
You're
enough
allowed to speak as a non-very Canadian.
about Canadian environmental
I'm not either.
governance, but with respect to the question, I think it's correct. We've spoken for the most part in very general terms, so we haven't really come up with a vision of specifically what should be done. And neither have the Canadians. The U.S. has a number of laws that are very specific on certain things that have to be done, but it doesn't yet amount to a shared vision of what the ultimate goal would be. And I'm not so sure this idea of gathering examples of what we're doing well will deal with the problem unless we define at the outset what we even mean by doing well. I mean, and that's really the problem. The conference, in my view, has presented a number of ideas in a direction of a vision, but it's far too general and broad to be giving guidance at this point to the government.
Well, since Norm was the person who invited me to the conference, I feel I need to answer the question as best I can. You know, it's a very interesting distinction that you propose between position and principles. I'm not sure if you're implying it, but this is what I heard, that it's somehow easier to get agreement on principles, so let's start there and then we'll do the discussion about positions. That's not really been my experience. When I was a senior civil servant in the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, for example, I remember there were representatives of a large American-owned car company flying up, about 10 people from Detroit to come and meet because they didn't like a particular regulation that the provincial government was about to bring down. And it was a question of numbers. But when it came to principles, they agreed with the principle, of course. They're a principled company, they would protect the environment, so there was no future in that discussion. The only discussion that was left was, what should the number be? And they misrepresented, I think, the truth. They said they will never invest another dollar in Ontario if we go ahead with the number that we have in mind. We did anyway, and then the next week they announced a massive new expenditure program. So from that experience of negotiation, it was the discussion of principles was not helpful. And I can't help but just say, you probably know Groucho Marx's famous statement about principles. He says, these are my principles. If you don't like them, I've got plenty more. I'll think more about that distinction. Maybe there's more to it than I've given you credit for.
Next question.
Yeah, I'd like to build on the principles thing, but a little more focused. In 1850, John Stuart Mill argued that the increase of wealth is not boundless. So he introduced this concept of a stationary state of economy. And 150 years later, wealth is money. And money is a number, and it can be doubled, and it can be tripled. And indeed, in many of the financial markets, I would contend that wealth can be created by mathematics alone. So my question is, each of you has proposed actions and solutions to this crisis. How many of those can be implemented without changing that paradigm that value can be measured by number? And if indeed it has to be changed, do you think that shift is possible without the crisis actually happening first?
Well, since I know the chapter quite well, maybe I should comment on it. It's a wonderful chapter, by the way. It's online. It's called On the Stationary State. And it's remarkable because he wrote it in 1848 and anticipates many of the arguments and points that we discuss at conferences like this. So it was very much ahead of its time. It still is, and was largely ignored, even though his book was very popular. So this question of wealth and money, I think we have to be really careful here. Obviously, it's possible to expand the money supply without limit. But if you expand the money supply, however that's done, whether that's through the actions of the central bank or through the commercial banks, which it turns out do in fact create most of the money that we use, but you don't also expand the output of real goods and services, you get inflation. So there's a distinction to be made. You're not actually expanding value, you're just raising prices. But the second part, I think, or the second point you were making was, I think, whether the financial system we have is a serious impediment to substantially and significantly changing the way the economy functions. And I used to be rather agnostic about that, but more recently now I've spent a fair bit of time trying to understand how the financial system operates. I do think it is a real obstacle, and that I'm very intrigued by some of the proposals that are out there to transform the banking and monetary systems of the sort we have in Canada. These are ideas that, funnily enough, one source is the IMF, a research study from the IMF talks about the Chicago Plan, which was a plan developed in the 1930s as part of the solution possibly to the Depression. But it's all about changing the nature of the banking system. And I think what we've learned through the recession, the financial crisis, is that we might have thought, maybe not you, but others, that the financial system served the real economy. It made the real economy possible, but the real story was the real economy, i.e. where goods and services are produced. But I think what became very clear from the financial crisis was that, if anything, it was the other way around, that the financial system was the dominant player in the overall economy and was not serving the real economy. It was serving the interests of a relatively small group, and therefore has to be changed if we are to redirect the real economy, and in doing so protect the environment.
Thanks for asking that question. It's really important. The slides of Terry's that I had in my presentation about the GitGat and what they stood to lose, what I meant to say at that point was that wealth is not a number, as you're absolutely pointing to. You know, the GitGat people feel wealthy because they have all that they need. They have an abundance of resources that they have relied upon for generations, and that's what they want and they need. I mean, and you know, so the younger generation, some of them are perceiving it differently, and it's not like they're not also experiencing those kinds of transitions, but the truth is inherent in that we do all actually realize in one way or another that wealth is not a number. And this is one thing that I wanted to say about paradigms that also goes to Dan's talk. You know, we use the word paradigm and it suggests that it's a stark choice between one or the other, and we live by it all the time. I think that's clearly not the case. Because you know, everybody, even your staunchest, most conservative economists who live by that paradigm in their professional world, most of them have personal lives where they don't live by that, right? And so we've actually tested, so I would consider them metaphors more than paradigms. You use a metaphor and you put it down in a different context and you pick up a different one, right? And so in the context of the economy, we might use that metaphor quite frequently. All the solutions that I talked about don't actually require that people put down that metaphor with respect to the economy, although I would imagine that most of them would be aided if that did happen. But you know, with respect to going back to that conversation just for a few seconds on ecosystem services and that metaphor there, we actually tested to see whether people could hold this metaphor. So not the terms themselves of ecosystem services, which put people off, admittedly, but the idea that nature gives us benefits, you know, gives us things that we benefit from. And what we found was that doesn't impede people's ability to answer questions about what nature brings to them that are benefit in terms that rely upon other metaphors, you know, in terms that invoke intrinsic values and appreciation of nature and reciprocal relations and stewardship. And, you know, I mean, so we have lots of those kinds of answers. We expected that it would be quite different when we were talking with First Nations people. I absolutely thought, you know, based on a few interactions that I had, that they would reject this notion. Because I'd had one First Nations person say to me, actually it was a Hawaiian First People man, who said, you know, ecosystem services are all well and good, but if you're not also talking about how we can serve the planet, then that's not a complete conversation. Now, so he didn't reject the notion, but I thought there would be others who did. And what we found in our work is that actually it's a very labile concept. I mean, most people do, they wear that hat, right? They use that metaphor. We recognize we do benefit from nature, but we also serve nature.
Can I add another comment? Canada keeps a balance sheet. There's something called the National Balance Sheet of Canada. I don't suppose you read it at bedtime like I do, but it's quite interesting because it divides the assets of the country into two main categories. Non-financial assets, which are things like houses, consumer durables, land, all the things that you can actually touch and hold and really benefit from. And so that's one set, the non-financial assets. Then there are the financial assets and financial liabilities. Now this is interesting because every time a financial liability is created, a financial asset is created at exactly the same time. So if you borrow money from the bank for a mortgage, the mortgage that you borrowed is your liability, but it's an asset of the bank because you're going to have to pay it back. Now what does this mean when you look at the national balance sheet of a country? If you look at the financial assets and financial liabilities, they cancel each other out. Zero. All that's left are the non-financial assets of the country. which is the real value of what an economy produces. I thought you'd like to know that.
I know why there's nothing in my bank account.
I just want to respond to the question about disasters. And I think it's really interesting if you look at the history of disasters, you see that oftentimes their biggest impact happened in terms of local shifts in practice. Just look at Hurricane Hazel and what it did in Ontario. It created the conservation authorities, created a new and different type of flood map. It produced flood prediction mechanisms that were much improved. But generally the notion was that you're going to engineer your way out of this. Now, it's very interesting to see that while that may work on a local or regional scale, it's harder to make disaster work on a global scale. And what we see is that crises keep happening, and we seem to be starting afresh all the time with new ideas on how to respond to that. And what we do is we continue, however, in exactly the same direction. Right now, Canada's, when Kyoto was signed, we're 61% over what the goal was. How much disaster do we need on a global basis before we start to recognize that we reach the tipping point? And what I find quite interesting is that in this conversation here at this summit, you begin to see that it's very likely going to be the economic element. It's going to be the cost of this. Yes. And so you've got to stop cheering for a disaster. But I do think it's going to be the cost of this in terms not just of economics, not just in terms of property damage, but human suffering that's going to do it.
Another question.
Peter, could I speak to the issue of speaking to the converted?
Yes.
Okay. I think this is really an interesting question because I should submit to you that I very rarely speak to an audience that is like this. And
you're from Alberta, right?
20% of the panel's from Alberta. But I want to say to you that in the same way that the other panelists have probably spoken to very, very difficult audience, I have to tell you a funny story. After the flooding that happened there, I was invited by the University of Calgary to speak downtown in Calgary at a distinguished lecture, which included, of course, everybody in the energy industry. And I want you to know that it isn't always as pleasant as this. I felt when I was speaking, now some of you may have read Harry Potter and know about the Dementors. The Dementors were prison, or the guards at the prison of Azkaban, and they could put their heads over yours and suck your soul out. I had a feeling that there were several people in the audience that weren't just after my soul, the skeleton was going to go too. So I think it's really important to know that it's through consistency and trust in what we know and confidence in our networks and a constant reassessment of our knowledge and information that allows us to speak and hopefully influence the attitudes of those who don't feel as we do. And I think it's an important thing for all of us to consider.
Another question.
Yes, thank you. We've heard a number of times about the impact of overpopulation and how it affects global warming. The fact of the matter is that our leaders in Canada and the United States and the UK and other developed countries are constantly have their time and energy taken up trying to put the lid on some conflict that has resulted from the actions of some dictator on the other side of the world. And that distracts them from dealing with these kind of issues that I'm quite sure most of them would prefer to be dealing with. Is there not one, and that's very tricky business to try to give advice about population growth to another country, but is there not one or two things that the developed world could do to nudge the developing world towards doing something about their population?
Well, as somebody who did his postdoc with Paul Ehrlich, this is always on my mind. The population problem is mostly solving itself with inertia, right? So it's inertia in the form of young people. There are more young people in many of these countries who will still come of age. And so even though on average people are having now closer to 2 children per person, per woman, obviously, it's going to take a little while before growth actually gets to replacement levels. But you know, what we found over the last 30 years of these kinds of interventions is basically that the most effective thing for addressing population growth in the developing world is just to make their lives better, especially the women. So it's education and empowerment of women and making sure that they have the choices. I mean, so we should do more of that. I mean, and the rest of it, I think we can leave to them.
Elena.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was going to talk about education and empowerment of women as well, but I also think it's important that we don't just focus on those people out there, but turn the spotlight also on ourselves. And we have a really serious problem here in Canada and North America, and it's not really overpopulation, it's consumption. And I think that if we're going to do the sorts of things that we need to do in other places, which we do need to do, I won't argue that we don't need to do those things, but I think it's only fair that we also turn a pretty strong spotlight on ourselves and ask about the problems that we're causing with our own overconsumption.
Well, I figure if we don't do it the way that the other panelists have described, that our contaminants will do it for us. Because we're seeing in water substances of emerging concern that are truly troubling from a reproductive point of view, endocrine altering substances, hormones. We're seeing demasculation and feminization in aquatic ecosystems, and we're seeing widespread reproductive changes in human populations, in part because of how many chemical substances there are in our atmosphere and in our water. So we do it one way, and perhaps nature will do it for another, and I'm hoping that we do it proactively. And one last comment on this, it's really difficult because in a warmer world with more turbulent weather, there's going to be a growing number of climate-related conflicts and a lot more distractions. So getting the attention of politicians, again, speaks to why we need to get this on the agenda now.
I have a question, a comment and a question. I've been going to conferences now for, and my field is limnology, for the better part of 50 years. And I should say that virtually with every conference or get-together, I've gone home feeling quite buoyed and quite enthused and quite excited, whether it's a simple technology that I could use or whatever. I'm going home from this conference feeling, I'm trying to get the right word, but I would probably say it's frightened. And but members of the panel can allow me to go home feeling less frightened if you had an example of one country or one region, whether it's a developed country or a developing country, where the kinds of actions that you folks are recommending are showing some signs of success. So I need to go home feeling less frightened.
Well, I've already cited the European Union Water Framework Directive, and as a limnologist, you'll know that they have done experiments in Europe where they have proven demonstrably that they're able to reverse eutrophication out of the processes. So I think there are examples such as that do point the way, even in more densely populated circumstances that we have now. So the hope that I have is that we're going to take advantage of those examples. We're going to adopt some of the strategies and the programs that the other panelists have put forward. And the key thing, however, is that in going home fearful, I think the fear shouldn't be that these things are going to happen. The fear should be that we don't act and prevent them. So that's where my hesitation and my fear resides. Not in the fact that we can't do it, because I believe we can. It's that we don't mobilize fast enough in order to do that.
Well, it may surprise you, but I've got to point to Latin America as a place or a region where some very interesting and positive developments are taking place. You wouldn't know that from the coverage that's given in the mainstream media here. I'm thinking of the country I know best is Venezuela. I go there very often for family reasons. And the changes that have been introduced in that country in the last 15 years are quite phenomenal in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of the place and role of women, transportation, infrastructure. What they've done is they've diverted their very substantial oil revenues to supporting public well-being. And taken it away from a relatively small proportion of the population who's not very happy with that. But it's not just that country. There's been tremendous movements in Latin America to establish regional organizations for mutual defense, for cultural cooperation, for economic policy, a deliberate attempt to distance themselves somewhat from the global economy so that they have more control over their own future. And if you look at some of the sort of indices that are now being experimented with, like the Happy Planet Index, which is based upon, on the numerator, a measure of happy lives, which is longevity and how happy people report themselves to be, divided by the ecological footprint, which is a measure of the pressure they're placing on the biosphere. It's the Latin American countries that come out as a group at the top. So if you want some encouraging news and you want some positive places to look at, right in our own hemisphere, but it's just not well covered in our media, even on ideas.
Take note of that.
I would point to the example of South Africa, which is a country that wrote a new constitution within our lifetimes, within my lifetime. And one of the things that's in that constitution is that it gives rights to ecosystems for water. So the ecosystems themselves have inherent rights to water before people get access to that water. So that's something that came out of deep scientific understanding of how ecosystems work and the importance of water. It was generated by great crisis, but I think it's an example of how out of great social crisis can come great ecological good if we're prepared to take the action that we need to take.
I'll give you a couple of examples. Yesterday when I was talking about that bay in New Zealand at Tasman Bay, I also referred to Chesapeake Bay in the northeast of the United States of America. They've been through a pretty amazing restoration of that bay. I mean, they're not finished by any stretch, but that bay went from having widespread oyster reefs and a process that filtered the bay, all of the bay's water basically on average every couple of days to a point of complete eutrophication, sedimentation, and through active restoration of placing oysters and seeding oyster beds basically, and also controlling the inflow of sediment and nitrogen and phosphorus into that bay, they've really turned it around. In terms of other kinds of changes, I'd point to my home at the moment in Vancouver. Vancouver is poised to become, by their call at least, the greenest city in the world by 2020. And they're really walking the walk, I would say. I mean, it's a very ambitious goal, and they can't succeed by every metric. But, if you compare Toronto and Vancouver, at least, when you guys were in Toronto, at least those of you who were in there, tearing out your bike lanes, we were putting a whole lot in. Now, that might have something to do with our respective mayors. I'd love to see Rob Ford get together with Gregor Mayer.
You should be tearing out the mayor.
I'd like to see Rob Ford and Gregor Robertson get together for, say, a bike ride. But, and it's really having an effect. Because, in Vancouver, not only has ridership in terms of bike ridership and also walking trips both gone up quite markedly, but total number of car trips has gone down despite the growing population. So, it's really having an effect when you put in a concerted effort.
Yeah, I work primarily now in impacts and management of impacts of biological invasions, which inherently involve international interactions and are really a global phenomenon. And there are nations that, at some cost, based on scientific information, have managed this quite well. They've evolved approaches to manage it well. The two obvious examples would be New Zealand and South Africa. And the one place that's really failed miserably, in spite of the scientific knowledge and even the regulations supposed to deal with this, is Europe. It's been really a disaster, despite the Council of Europe and European Union regulations doing exactly what you said for water, leaving each nation on its own to figure out how to implement the regulation, so long as they do implement it. And it hasn't worked at all. And many nations have done very little, and they don't really seem to have a mechanism to change this. So it's quite different from the water management notion that you've discussed.
Can I just make one other observation? We talked about the European Union later, but it's what I want to point out too, that we should not forget there's lots of really good things happening in this country. And one example I want to bring is Lake of the Woods, the Water Quality Forum, and their international science-based collaboration on maintenance and restoration of the health of the entire Lake of the Woods aquatic ecosystem. And I think these things are working, and I think you've got good examples of Red River Basin Commission. You have some good examples also in Ontario. So we ought to note that it's often these initiatives are isolated, and sometimes the fear is that the changes have happened so quickly and so broadly that even the best examples may be overwhelmed, but that's not the case yet. That's something we wish to avoid, but right now I think there's still room to move, and the point that I want to make and hope that this summit makes is that we have to be moving while that room still exists.
Yeah, can we pause on this and add a few more? I kept on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we can finish with this one actually, because we're getting close to the end, and I think it's good to finish in a half an hour.
Yeah, I had one other example that occurred to me while people were talking, which is the Oberlin, Ohio, which is a small town with a small college, but is poised to be the first joint town and college project that will bring the two together to be completely carbon neutral by the year 2020, and they are on track to do it. And which is amazing. And the thing I wanted to point out that occurs to me that brings it back to this room is that it's really being led by a few very committed individuals who saw an opportunity and were willing to do what it took to make it happen. And I think the hope for me in sitting here and looking out at all of you is that I see a lot of strongly committed individuals who probably do see problems and see ways to turn those problems into opportunities to make great things happen in this region.
First Kai, then Peter.
Yeah, so I'll give you a few more that I also thought of while people were mentioning theirs. In terms of actual consequences of those kinds of changes, it's amazing to see the wildlife that's coming back into the Vancouver area. I mean, we've got salmon runs that are coming back to city creeks. It's amazing. I mean, you can walk through the industrial park area of Burnaby, which is a suburb of Vancouver, and see salmon coming up the streams. It's absolutely incredible. UBC is actually a leader in this kind of thing, and we're poised to become carbon neutral as a campus within a decade or something like that. I should have that statistic, but I don't. And another country, I'm not sure if Peter mentioned it already, but Costa Rica is a real leader in. It's amazing to see the forest cover that's come back on that country as a result of several different kinds of policies, and they're really seeing the benefits of it, and they're known for ecotourism in part because of that, and that fuels their economy.
Well, the example I was going to point to that's close to home is the creation of the Greenbelt around the Greater Toronto area. Just setting aside, if you like, or controlling development in almost 2 million acres of land deliberately to prevent sprawl. This is quite a remarkable initiative, and again, if you're looking for examples that point us in the right direction, I think that's a very good one to think about.
I went to university in Great Britain, and I am subject periodically to barrages of emails from friends in Britain telling me how bad Canada is on how many fronts. And then not long ago I got one saying, don't you live in Ontario? And is Ontario the first jurisdiction on the planet to have put in strong restrictions on coal as a source of fuel for hydroelectricity? And For me, it was a watershed, is perhaps the wrong word to use, but it felt like it. That after years and years of being bombarded with complaints about everything from the seal fishery to foreign aid to Canada's involvement in various wars and activities to every ecological issue you can imagine, because believe me, we do not have a good reputation internationally on that front anymore. To get one email saying, is it possible you live in a place where something good was done, really turned my head around, made me feel marginally optimistic again about what's happening here. I think we have come near to the end of this session, which brings us to the end of the 2014 Muskoka Summit. I want to thank you all for your questions today. I think I made the right decision by turning the floor and turning my job over to you. It was another excellent session. Thanks to the panel. I've already said publicly how brilliant I think each and every one of them is, and they proved it all today. Thanks to Bob Bateman, who had to leave to accept an honorary degree in Halifax, by the way, so he couldn't be here today, but regretted that enormously and wanted me to pass that on to you. And finally, thanks to the organizers of the 2014 Summit, some of the same ones. At lunch that there was a place where people could return their badges, because I wanted to wear it today to this session. I'm going to return it symbolically now, but I'd like it kept so that I can come back and wear it again in 2 years.